In 2025, a single oceanfront property in Sagaponack sold for $115 million. Nearby, another sat listed at $152.5 million, the highest asking price ever recorded on the east end of Long Island. That same year, in the same waters those estates overlook, the federal government renewed a fishery disaster declaration for Peconic Bay. Not a slowdown, not a bad season, a collapse. The bay scallop population reduced by more than 99%. 10 miles inland, a teacher, a nurse, a firefighter, the people who keep these towns running cannot find a year-round rental within 20 miles of where they work. The wealth did not build the Hamptons around the water. It has been quietly building around its absence. This is the story of how a 40-mile stretch of sand became the most expensive real estate in America, and what it had to consume to get there. Chapter 1. The Land Before the Names. 20,000 years ago, a glacier receded and left behind a spine of sand and gravel stretching into the Atlantic. It is called the South Fork now, a 100-mile arm of Long Island, pinched between the calm water of Peconic Bay to the north and the open ocean to the south. The ice did not simply retreat, it dropped what it carried. Boulders, silt, and outwash soil settled into ridges and hollows, and where buried blocks of ice melted last, the ground collapsed into kettle ponds. Small, deep, spring-fed basins that still dot the landscape today, feeding fresh water into a place otherwise ringed by salt. Along the ocean side, the surf built barrier beaches, long ribbons of dune that absorbed the Atlantic's force before it reached the mainland. Those beaches were never fixed in place. Longshore currents pushed sand east along the shore face, closing one inlet while opening another within a generation. The geology did the work first. Everything that came after, the farms, the fleets, the fortunes, arrived because the land had already been arranged to receive them. That arrangement made the South Fork valuable long before anyone thought to price it. The outwash soil, sandy and well-drained, proved unusually fertile for grain and vegetables. A rarity on a barrier landscape, where sand alone tends to starve a crop rather than feed it. The bays behind the dunes ran shallow and calm, sheltered from the ocean swell, thick with shellfish and finfish that never had to be hunted far from shore. Fresh water sat close to the surface, easy to reach by well, in a region where salt intrusion made that far from guaranteed. 3 advantages, rarely found together on a strip of land this narrow: fertile ground, a stocked bay, and shelter from the sea that made both livable. Nothing about it was accidental. It was geology working in the land's favor before anyone had a name for it. For centuries before any Europeans set foot on the beach, the Shinnecock and the Montaukett built their lives around that same geology. They farmed the interior in the warmer months, working corn, beans, and squash into the outwash soil the glacier had left behind. They fished the Peconic and its tributary bays with weirs and dugout canoes, drawing scallops, oysters, and finfish from water that rarely froze and never lay far from a landing point. And each autumn and winter, right whales moved south along the coast on their migration, passing close enough to see from the beach, sometimes close enough to touch by boat. A lookout posted on a dune rise would scan the water for the whale's spout, and once the animals surfaced within range, the Shinnecock and Montaukett launched a narrow boat straight into the breakers, working as a coordinated crew to close the distance before it could sound again and pull free into deep water. The harpoon they carried had no explosive charge. It trailed a wooden drogue that dragged against the water, tiring the whale and marking its position until the crew could finish the work within sight of shore. The whale did not have to be chased across an ocean. It came to them. That fact, deep water lying close to shore, whales passing within a boat's length of the beach, was the single detail that would matter most to the next arrivals. English colonists across the Sound in Connecticut heard about the South Fork's harbors, its farmland, its shellfish beds and its whales, and by the early 17th century, they were already looking east. What drew them was not empty land. It was land already proven by people who had lived on it and worked it for generations to be capable of feeding a settlement and, more than that, of yielding a commodity that required no ship, no harpoon fleet, no voyage of months. Only a lookout posted on a dune and a crew willing to run into cold surf on short notice. Shore whaling would not require the English to leave the coastline at all. By 1640, that calculation was no longer theoretical. Chapter 2. The Purchase. The English came ashore at a scrap of land not much bigger than a rowboat's turning radius in the spring of 1640, having sailed from Lynn, Massachusetts, with a patent from the Earl of Stirling and no particular interest in asking twice. History gave the landing place a name that sounds invented and is not. Conscience Point, so called. Tradition holds, because a woman, stepping into the mud, declared her conscience finally settled. Whatever she meant by it, the town that grew up behind her became Southampton, the first English settlement in what would, more than a century later, become New York State. It was not a plantation of ambition. It was a farming and fishing outpost, built around a meeting house governed by covenant, hemmed in on every side by ocean, and by people who had lived on that shoreline for thousands of years before the patent existed. 8 years passed before the English reached for more of it. Theophilus Eaton was an English-born merchant who had traded across the Baltic and the Levant before crossing to New England and helping found the colony at New Haven. On April 29, 1648, he and Edward Hopkins, governor of the Connecticut colony, arranged to buy more than 31,000 acres of Montauk land without ever setting foot on it. The sellers were 4 sachems, whose names the deed recorded and the histories mostly forgot: Wyandanch, Pagadicut, Mumaweta, and Nowodona. The price was itemized like a ship's manifest: 20 coats, 24 knives, 100 muxes, the small awl-like tools used to drill wampum shell, alongside hatchets, hoes, and looking glasses folded into the same account. Not a gift, an actual sale, recorded and witnessed for land that ran from the ocean to the bay. Nothing about the transaction was hidden or improvised. It was paperwork, drawn up in the same careful hand a merchant would use to record a shipment of cloth or grain, and filed where a later clerk could find it. Settlers coming down from New England took that paperwork and built a town on it, naming the place Maidstone after a market town in Kent. Maidstone did not keep the name. Within a generation it was East Hampton, twinned with Southampton to its west, and the two towns settled into a rhythm that would hold for 2 centuries without much changing: plowing, fishing, town meeting, church, and, running under all of it the way the aquifer runs under the whole peninsula, whaling from the beach, worked exactly as the Montaukett had worked it for generations before an Englishman ever wrote the word Hampton on a map. The settlers needed men who already knew the water, and they hired them. Montaukett harpooners went out in the whaleboats launched off Southampton and East Hampton beaches, reading surf and whale sign the way their fathers had read it. The same skill described in the previous chapter, now performed for wages instead of for the whole of the catch. Montaukett pilots guided those same boats through shoals the settlers had not yet learned to read on their own. The skill had not left the peninsula. It had simply changed employers. For 200 years, that was the whole of it. 2 farming towns, 2 churches, a whaling economy small enough to run on rowboats and lookout platforms, a population that grew the way populations grow in places nobody is fighting over. Town meetings set the rules for who could plant where and whose livestock could graze the common land. And the same body governed the whaling crews, dividing a whale's proceeds by share among the men who had gone into the surf to take it. Wool and hides went out by cart to the harbor landings, salt hay cut from the marsh-fed livestock through winters when little else grew, and whale oil, rendered in try-pots set up within sight of the beach, filled the casks that made the trip back to New England worth the crossing. Ships worked out of the harbors at Sag Harbor and 3 Mile Harbor. Whale oil went out, English goods came in, and the South Fork stayed as remote as its geography intended, closer to 100 miles from Manhattan by water and considerably farther than that by any road worth naming. Then, in the years after the Civil War, a survey crew appeared on the horizon, driving stakes toward Bridgehampton. Chapter 3. The Line and the First Cottage. The railroad arrives before the money does, and in the Hamptons, it arrives on a fixed date. In June 1870, the Long Island Railroad pushes its track into Bridgehampton, a spur laid across potato fields and scrub pine toward a destination that had, until that spring, no reason to expect one. 8 months later, in February 1871, a second station opens in Southampton. The effect is immediate and arithmetic. A trip that had consumed the better part of 2 days by carriage and ferry now takes a few hours by rail, and the South Fork, remote by design, insulated by geography since the 17th century, becomes for the first time a place a man could reach after breakfast in Manhattan and sleep in by nightfall. The timetable itself becomes its own advertisement, printed and reprinted in New York papers, each new express run shaving another half hour off a trip that had once required an overnight stop. Money follows track. It always does. Richard Easterbrook was a Connecticut-born manufacturer who had built his fortune supplying the country with fountain pens at a moment when the fountain pen was still a novelty worth paying for. He had made his money quietly, in a workshop and then a factory. And by the mid-1870s, he was looking for a place to spend it that Newport and Saratoga had not already claimed. He found Bridgehampton a few miles from the new depot, and between 1877 and 1882 he built Tremedden, a sprawling, shingled cottage on the dunes. The first structure on the South Fork built expressly and unapologetically for summer leisure. Historians of the region generally credit it as the founding structure of the Gilded Age Hamptons, the building that proved the concept before anyone else was willing to risk the capital. Others did not take long to follow. Over the next 4 decades, more than 900 mansions rise along the same stretch of dune and farmland, a construction boom driven by the same railroad timetable and the same appetite for coastal air among men who had made their money in steel, in rail, in dry goods, in oil. McKim, Mead, and White, the firm that would come to define an entire generation of East Coast wealth architecture, take on commissions here alongside less storied, but equally busy local builders working in the shingle style, long roof lines, deep porches, a studied informality that cost a fortune to appear casual. Shingle weathered to silver within a season or two of salt wind, and that weathering became part of the style's appeal. A house designed to look as though the ocean itself had aged it rather than a contractor. The cottages multiply block by block, dune by dune, each one a small monument to a fortune made somewhere else and spent here. At the far end of the same peninsula, a different economy is taking hold, and it owes nothing to the railroad's leisure traffic. Montauk, exposed and undeveloped, is becoming what it will remain for the rest of the century. New York State's largest commercial fishing port, its docks crowded not with yachts, but with trawlers, its economy built on cod and swordfish rather than architecture and acreage. Where Bridgehampton's new cottages are photographed for their porches, Montauk's harbor is measured in tonnage, landed, and ice consumed. A working economy running on a schedule set by the fish rather than the season. The two economies grow up on the same 18 miles of land, facing the same ocean, and for now they have nothing to do with each other. The mansions keep coming. The fortunes keep arriving, decade after decade, each one larger than the last, each one certain of its own permanence. Tremedden is joined by dozens, then hundreds of houses built on the same premise, that the money would keep coming, that the summers would keep repeating themselves without consequence. For 100 years, roughly, that premise holds. Then, in October 1971, a building inspector walks up the drive of a decaying shingled cottage in East Hampton, one of the old ones, built in the same years and in the same spirit as Tremedden itself. He is not there to admire the architecture. Chapter 4. The Rot Behind the Hedge. He is not a building inspector in the generic sense. He is a field officer with the Suffolk County Health Department, and he has brought 2 colleagues and a warrant with him up the gravel drive at 3 West End Road. The house ahead is Grey Gardens, 28 rooms under a shingled roof, built in 1897 in the same spirit of assumed permanence as every other cottage on this stretch of East Hampton. It has not been repainted in decades. The hedges have not been cut. They have grown into walls 12 feet high, sealing the property from the street and from the neighbors who complained about it. Inside lives Edith Bouvier Beale, and inside with her lives her daughter, also named Edith. Edith Bouvier Beale was a New York-born socialite and trained singer who had married into money in 1917 and lost the marriage and most of the money by 1946. She was the aunt of Jacqueline Bouvier, who by 1971 has been Jacqueline Kennedy and is now Jacqueline Onassis. Her daughter, called Little Edie, is Jacqueline's first cousin. For 25 years, the 2 women had lived alone in the house, income reduced to a fixed trust, staff reduced to none, repairs deferred until deferral became the only policy the house had left. What the inspectors find, they log room by room. No functioning running water in a house of 28 rooms. Fleas in the carpets, the furniture, the mattresses. Cat colonies numbering in the dozens, uncounted precisely because they will not hold still to be counted. And raccoons nesting in an upstairs bedroom that has not been used as a bedroom in years. Garbage accumulated to waist height in some rooms, ceilings open to the sky in others. Structural decay throughout. The county's report does not use the word tragedy. It uses the word condemnable. Within weeks, the story reaches the National Enquirer, then the wire services, then every paper that had ever run a photograph of a Hampton summer. The appeal is not the squalor by itself. It is the address. 900 mansions stand within a few miles of this one, each maintained, each insured, each photographed for magazines that treat the area as the country's most reliable evidence of prosperity. And for years, none of their owners, and none of the reporters who covered them, had looked past this particular hedge. The facade had done its job. 25 years of decay had gone unnoticed, because unnoticed was the entire design of the place. In 1972, Jacqueline Onassis pays for the repairs herself, quietly, enough to bring the house above the county's condemnation line, and no further. Big Edie will die there in 1977. Little Edie will sell the house in 1979. Neither event makes the papers the way the raid did. 4 miles north and 26 years earlier, a different order of arrival. In November 1945, Jackson Pollock and his wife, the painter Lee Krasner, move out of a Manhattan walk-up and into a converted fisherman's homestead on Springs Fireplace Road, bought for $5,000 with money loaned by the collector Peggy Guggenheim. Pollock was a Wyoming-born painter who had spent the previous decade broke, drinking, and largely unknown outside a small circle of New York abstractionists. He arrived in Springs looking for quiet and cheap rent and found both. Willem de Kooning follows within a few years. Then others, Franz Klein, John Little, the poet Frank O'Hara on his visits from the city, until Springs is not a retreat for a few painters, an actual colony, unzoned, unphotographed, running on rented rooms and shared paint. Nobody here is maintaining a hedge. The economy of this end of the Hamptons has nothing to do with the economy of the mansions 4 miles south. And for the next 2 decades, the 2 versions of the place develop side by side without much acknowledging each other. the same post-war years that give the Hamptons this second reputation, unpretentious, working, cheap enough for an out-of-work painter, are also the years in which the land underneath both versions starts quietly changing hands. Chapter 5: The Working Land. Long Island in the 1950s is still, by acreage, an agricultural county wearing a resort's reputation. Roughly 75,000 acres go into potatoes every year. Suffolk County supplying a meaningful share of the nation's early crop, trucked out before the New England harvest even starts. The East End baymen work the bays the way their fathers worked them. Halsane nets dragged out by rowboat and hauled back by hand. Striped bass taken from the surf in volumes that would be unthinkable within a generation. Two economies occupy the same 40 miles of land. One serves oysters at the yacht club, the other feeds itself, sells the surplus, and answers to nobody's summer calendar. Picture 3 Mile Harbor before 6 in the morning, sometime in the middle 1950s. The water is still black. A Halsane crew, 4 men, sometimes 6, walks a net out from the beach in a rowboat, paying it off the stern in a slow arc, then works it back hand over hand, the corks bobbing, the lead line dragging bottom. The work is done by feel as much as by sight, the weight on the rope telling the crew what the water will not yet show them. Striped bass thrash in the shallows as the net closes. Half a mile inland, potato trucks are already idling on Springs Fireplace Road, engines running before the dew burns off, waiting on a crop that pays the mortgage whether or not a single tourist ever sees it. Nobody on that beach is dressed for a photograph. Nobody in those trucks has heard of Newport. The bay and the field are running the same shift they have run for 3 centuries, a shift with less than 20 years left to run. This is the version of the Hamptons that gives the place its post-war reputation, and the reputation is deliberately modest. Where Newport built marble to be photographed, the East End built shingle to be lived in. Small cottages, weathered gray, a few miles of quiet beach, nobody was trying to sell to anyone. The Springs Art Colony supplies the intellectual alibi for that pose. Painters who cannot afford Newport's version of prestige and do not particularly want it. The baymen and the potato farmers supply the economic reality underneath the alibi. Not a backdrop hired for the season, an actual working population, one that sells its potatoes by the truckload to wholesalers in Riverhead and its fish by the pound to markets that never ask where the money that will later remake the shoreline is coming from. For 20 years, the unpretentiousness is simply true. It stops being true at a specific, measurable rate. The East End holds roughly 100,000 acres of farmland at the start of the post-war boom. By the early 1970s, close to 90% of it is gone, sold, subdivided, and paved over as the tract house economy that produced Levittown 30 years earlier finishes its long crawl east along the parkways. No single sale causes this. No single decade does either. It happens field by field, farmer by farmer, each transaction reasonable on its own terms and catastrophic in aggregate. A widow selling off the back acreage rather than hire help she can no longer afford. A son with no interest in inheriting a potato operation that clears less each year than the land underneath it is now worth standing empty. 90% of the working land, one generation. The first sales go through one deed at a time, each one small enough on its own to look like nothing more than an owner cashing out. The bay is a slower matter and slower still to show damage. It has taken the runoff of 3 centuries of farming, the discharge of every cesspool built along its shore, the propeller wash of a growing summer fleet, and it has gone on producing scallops and striped bass and clams in commercial quantity through all of it, absorbing what it is given the way it always has. That capacity is not infinite. Over the next decade and a half, nitrogen, silt, and heat arrive in volumes the bay has never had to absorb before. In 1985, the water changes color. Chapter 6. The water changes color. In 1976, Congress passes the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act, extending federal jurisdiction 200 miles out from the coastline and placing the waters that feed Montauk's fleet under a regulatory apparatus that did not exist a decade earlier. In Amagansett, a hamlet whose baymen worked the same beaches described 2 chapters earlier, nobody reads the act as a warning. It is signed into law and forgotten within a season, filed under matters that concern distant water fleets and foreign trawlers, not the inshore world of pound nets and haul seines worked from Napeague to 3 Mile Harbor. The baymen do not feel it yet. It is bureaucratic scaffolding, erected 9 years before the thing it will later be used to justify. A fisheries law aimed at foreign trawlers, not yet a ban on anyone's own nets. Then the water changes color for real. In May 1985, a bloom of Oreococcus anophageferens, a species new to science, so small it slips through standard plankton nets and had never before been isolated or named, turns the Peconic and Shinnecock estuaries the color of weak coffee in bays that have supported a commercial scallop fishery since before Suffolk County existed in its present borders. It does not clear by August, as algal blooms typically do. It returns in 1986, in 1987, in 1988, thicker each summer, starving the eelgrass beds of light and starving the scallops of the phytoplankton they filter to survive. The water turns opaque enough that a bayman standing waist-deep can no longer see his own boots. Bay scallop landings, which had averaged close to 300,000 pounds a year through the previous decade, Lenaut Biesterolictrage, fall to approximately 300 pounds by the 1987 to 1988 season. The collapse is not partial, it exceeds 99%. Scientists spend the rest of the decade tracing the bloom's chemistry back to its source, and the source is nitrogen, delivered not chiefly by industry, not chiefly by agriculture, but by the cesspools and septic systems of a shoreline built up, acre by acre, through the 30 years before it. Each new estate along the Peconic, each lawn fertilized to golf course density, each guest cottage added behind the main house, has fed a slow discharge into a groundwater table that empties, eventually, into the bay. The wealth chronicled in the chapters before this, one did not merely sit beside the water. It fed it for a generation, continuously and invisibly, until the bay's capacity to absorb nitrogen ran out in a single measurable spring. The two economies are the same economy. In 1990, the New York State Legislature bans haul signing in state waters, closing out a method that had worked the South Fork's beaches for over a century, under pressure from the Department of Environmental Conservation and an increasingly organized sport fishing lobby that blames commercial netting for the decline in striped bass stocks. It is the same method staged at 3 Mile Harbor in the chapter before this one. The net paid out by dory, the crew hauling it hand over hand up the sand. After 1990, the technique is not modernized, not replaced, not phased out. It is made illegal, and the men who worked it are left with boats built for a trade that no longer legally exists. In April 1992, several hundred baymen gather at a rally in Montauk to fight the ban, and among them is Billy Joel, East Hampton resident, boat owner, a public name neither the DEC nor the sport fishing lobby had budgeted for. He speaks from a flatbed trailer parked on the circle. The signs are hand-lettered, the crowd modest by the standards of a stadium, but sizable for a trade that has never organized before. The rally changes no votes in Albany. The ban holds. While the baymen are losing the argument in Albany, a different species of buyer is already walking the same shoreline the nets can no longer reach. Not old money, not the WASP families installed since the 1890s, but a newer class arriving on leveraged buyout profits and the first hedge fund fortunes of the decade. They are not interested in scallops or striped bass. They are interested in the water view. Chapter 7. The New Buyers. The money that moves into the Hamptons through the 1980s and into the 1990s does not come from railroads or shipping, or the accumulated interest of 19th century fortunes. It comes from leveraged buyouts, from junk bonds, from the first hedge funds the American economy had ever produced at scale, the WASP families who had summered here since the 1890s, the same families whose lawyers had out-argued the Bayman in Albany a decade earlier, begin selling. Their buyers are younger, faster, and unbothered by pedigree, arriving with cash rather than the multi-generational patience of a trust, and closing deals in weeks that an older family would have spent a season deliberating over. Land that had been valued for generations as farmland or scrub pine is now valued as frontage, and once that arithmetic takes hold, it does not reverse. Mansion size follows land value upward, decade after decade, without correction. The physical evidence sits on the ground itself. Potato barns that once stored the last crops of a dying agricultural economy are gutted and reframed as pool houses and three-car garages, their timber frames left exposed as a design feature rather than a structural necessity. Farmhouses where baymen and farmers had raised children for 4 and 5 generations are stripped to the studs and rebuilt on the same foundations as 10,000-square-foot trophy homes. The old roof lines, sometimes preserved as a nod to a history the new owners did not live. A barn here is not a metaphor. It is a building that once held potatoes and now holds a Range Rover and a wine refrigerator. The same transformation repeats down the length of the South Fork through the 1990s and 2000s. A hay barn becomes a screening room, a milking shed becomes a pool cabana, and the working outbuildings that once marked a farm's productivity become instead rustic set dressing, kept standing because their age is now worth more than their original function ever was. By 2014, the scale of the money has moved again. Barry Rosenstein was a Manhattan-born hedge fund manager who had built his career at Jana Partners, an activist fund known for forcing changes at the companies whose stock it bought. He was also, by his own description, an environmental activist. In 2014, he pays $147 million for 3 combined oceanfront parcels on Further Lane in East Hampton, setting the modern record for a single residential purchase in the Hamptons and confirming that the market now operates on a scale the potato farmers and baymen of earlier chapters would not recognize as real estate at all. The bay he might have called himself a protector of lies, less than 2 miles from the property line. By 2020, the median home price across the Hamptons reaches $920,500, dollars more than double the $402,000 median for Suffolk County as a whole. Landlords respond to the math the way landlords do. Year-round leases, the kind that once let a plumber or a schoolteacher rent a house through the winter, are increasingly abandoned in favor of summer-only terms and short-term listings on Airbnb and Vrbo, where a single July weekend can out-earn a month of a working tenant's rent. A house that once housed a family through a Suffolk County winter for $800 a month now sits empty from Labor Day to Memorial Day, held vacant on the calculation that a dozen summer weekends will out-earn 10 months of a year-round tenant paying rent on time. The people who keep the towns running are priced out of the towns they run. Teachers, nurses, firefighters, and restaurant staff commute in before dawn from towns 30 and 40 miles to the west, driving in on roads built for a summer population to serve a population that owns houses assessed in the 8 figures. Local coverage by this point has stopped calling it a housing shortage and started calling it what it is: a workforce shut out of the region its labor sustains. Home prices keep climbing through the decade that follows, setting new records as regularly as the old ones are broken. Underneath the water they overlook, something else is climbing too, a number no one puts on a real estate listing, and no one yet is required to. Chapter 8. What the Water Remembers. Underneath the docks and the dune grass, the mechanism is simpler than the numbers suggest. The Peconic Estuary Partnership, the body charged with monitoring the bay's health, names the culprit in its own reports: nitrogen, leaching for decades out of thousands of residential septic systems set into sand that filters almost nothing. Cesspools under mansions, cesspools under cottages, cesspools under the modest ranch houses of year-round residents doing exactly what their neighbors do. The nitrogen does not distinguish between a $150 million compound and a $400,000 salt box. It moves through the same groundwater from both, and it surfaces in the same bay. The die-offs begin in 2019, and they do not stop. Every summer that follows, adult scallop biomass collapses by more than 95%, wiped out in the weeks of highest heat before harvest season even opens. In 2021, the federal government makes it official, declaring a fishery disaster for the Peconic Bay scallop population, a designation usually reserved for storms, spills, singular catastrophes. This one gets renewed the next year, and the year after that. By 2025, disaster is no longer an event on a calendar. It is the baseline. The 2025 water quality reports read like a catalog of a system in retreat. Blue-green algal blooms spread across ponds that carry the town's oldest names: Georgica, Hook, Wainscott, with Wainscott Pond registering cyanobacteria so consistent the county stops calling it an event and starts calling it a condition. Water temperatures climb. Nitrogen levels sit above the ceiling the Peconic Estuary Partnership set for its own watershed. And in bay waters once prized for shellfishing clean enough to eat standing in the surf, fecal contamination closes beaches that needed no warning signs a generation ago. None of it touches the market. Buyers closing on 9-figure oceanfront parcels are not asking the Peconic Estuary Partnership for its watershed data, and no listing agent is required to attach it. If anything, scarcity of open shoreline, of untouched acreage, writes its own premium into the listings. In 2025, an oceanfront estate in Sagaponack closes at $115 million. Not far down the same coastline, another compound sits listed at $152.5 million, the highest asking price ever recorded on the east end of Long Island. A number attached to a house built to look at water the county's own scientists have just described as failing. Gray Gardens still stands, a half-mile from where the algae blooms are worst. It has been restored, its hedges cut into discipline, its shingles the color the market favors this decade, and it has sold since for a sum that would have stunned the two women who once shared it with dozens of cats. No running water, and no ceiling that had been repaired since 1971. The ruin it broadcast to the country that October is gone from the house. It has simply moved next door, into the water. Montauk's docks tell a version of the same story. Once the busiest fishing port in New York State, the harbor still fills each morning, but the boats have changed character. Draggers and longliners now share slips with sport fishing charters and mega yachts that burn more fuel in an afternoon than the old fleet often did in a week. The working harbor persists. What it works for has changed hands. In Springs, the houses Pollock and de Kooning once rented for a few dollars a week now sell, when they sell at all, for figures that would have covered a lifetime of canvas and turpentine many times over. And the art colony survives mostly as a name on a road sign and a wing of the local historical society. The potato fields that once ran to nearly 100,000 acres have shrunk to a scattered remnant, farmed now as much for the tax break on open space as for the crop itself. The bay is still there, flat and bright most mornings, breaking into small hard points of light wherever the wind touches it. Whalers once launched from this same sand, and 3 generations of baymen after them waded these shallows with hand nets before the ban closed that too. Some summers now the harbor closes to shellfishing altogether, roped off under algae warnings a few hundred yards from cedar shingle houses whose owners will spend at most 6 weeks a year behind those windows. The water keeps catching the light regardless.